The Federal Reserve is more than just a plot element in Creed of Gold. It is a real bank, and it really does loan money to the federal government. Joining me today is author and presidential historian Doug Wead. Doug, can you tell us a little bit more about what the Federal Reserve is and what it does? I think to many Americans, the Federal Reserve sounds like another government entity, much like the Federal Bureau of Printing and Engraving. What is the Federal Reserve?
Well, from what I read and study, it's not federal and it's not a reserve. That's the first thing that comes to mind, but it's a private bank that was set up with authorization from Congress, and the president names the committee members, the board members that sit on the Federal Reserve, so it does have that connection.
Could you tell us a little bit more about how the Federal Reserve works and how money is circulated into our economy?
Well, the Federal Reserve doesn't actually print money, but it can create money electronically and just deposit it in the banks, which it does through loans, through buying back of bonds that the banks hold in some cases. And in direct loans, it's 0% interest to corporations. Which was a bit of a surprise to some people. These are board members that sit on the board that vote to give themselves loans at 0% interest. Very nice arrangement. So just stop and think. We have the news focus on the U.S. Congress and who's going to win the election this year. And the Democrats are up 7 states. The Republicans, they're threatening in this state. And we follow very carefully the names of these people. Oh, the Republicans picked up 2 congressmen in Arizona now because of redistricting. And we follow it like it's just a fascinating horse race. But most people don't even know who the members of the Federal Reserve are, and they spend more money than the U.S. Congress. Nobody checks it, nobody questions it. So much of what is happening in the public arena in the debate of politics is totally transcended by the power and the significance of the Federal Reserve. They talk about a little tax here and a little tax there, and we'll lower this tax or raise this tax. It's meaningless compared to the trillions of dollars that are created by the Federal Reserve, which is a much bigger tax because it's diluting the value of the dollar that you have in your pocket, and that's a tax.
CNN reported that the Federal Reserve earned $77.4 billion in profits in 2011, $81.7 billion in 2010, and $53.4 billion in 2009. Could these figures, although I know many of them are taxed by the federal government with a special tax for the Federal Reserve, could these figures be turned around and used to pay down our national debt?
It's a good question. A lot of people have asked that, but in 2008, when we had this partial audit, it showed that $16 trillion was created by the Federal Reserve at a time when the national debt was somewhere around $12 trillion or less. So why couldn't that money have been used to wipe out the entire national debt accumulated over 200 years of our history? They created more money in one quantitative easing of the year 2008 than all the money and debt we'd accumulated in our entire history. They managed to create that much money in just 1 year electronically. So one wonders, it goes to banks, most of whom are represented by the board members of the Federal Reserve, who vote themselves these interest-free loans of trillions of dollars, not only to banks, and not only to banks in this country, but banks in other countries, not just Europe. We see that Anglo-American relationship and Franco-Anglo-American relationship, but banks in Korea. But in addition to that, loan direct money to major American corporations, not through the banks to the corporation, but directly to the corporation.
You mentioned a partial audit of the Federal Reserve. Is it time for a complete audit of the Federal Reserve?
Well, some politicians, Ron Paul and others, have called for a complete audit, and some politicians like Harry Reid have said we should have a complete audit, and then they changed their mind. There's a lot of pressure. I mean, The whole world is being financed by the Federal Reserve. The creation is money. If you're a part of it, you're sitting on one of these boards and your bank is going to get several $1 trillion and you yourself are going to get a wonderful salary out of gratitude from your own board of many millions of dollars in bonuses. It's pretty hard to say no to it. Pretty hard for the television networks not to be impacted by their advertisers, and in some cases the holding companies that own them, that are getting money directly from the Federal Reserve at 0% interest. So that big resort with all those hotels, and by the way, the 12th floor is all yours for you and your family, that whole project is suddenly on hold if this pipeline of free 0% interest money is suddenly plugged up and there's suddenly accountability. Should there be transparency? Absolutely. We should know how much money is being created and to whom it's given. The whole thing is fraught with danger. Bernanke has said he didn't want the Federal Reserve audited because it would become political if suddenly people knew and could debate where the money was going. But it is obviously political among those who make the decision. I mean, why should this company get $500 million in interest-free loans and then restructure their whole business and open up new franchises, and not my company or not this other company? I mean, who's to decide which company gets what and why?
Now, is it constitutional for a private bank to print money for the United States?
And I hate to say it, but it's almost irrelevant from the people who work in Washington, from their mindset. I was surprised as a citizen who got involved in government and politics and ended up in the White House. When you actually get to Washington and you see government operate, you find out that the U.S. Constitution is kind of like youth camp rules. You got to go to bed at 10 o'clock, and well, what are they going to do if you stay up till 11:30?
Wow, well, that's really something to hear. But
well, stop and think. Just a couple of years ago, a president couldn't listen in on your telephone without at least a signature of a judge. Now he can kill you. You can't foresee whether a president's motives are good or bad.
Right. It was ultimately a limitation on what the government could do, not just a blueprint for a nation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, do all of these inflationary efforts hurt the economy, and what are the consequences of seeing that spread out over a country?
Everything we have and we own is being diluted. It's tragic. It's a moral crisis. The average person doesn't have time to understand monetary policy. It trusts its government. It trusts the banks. They don't expect the government to be corrupt and crooked and the banks to be corrupt and crooked. They come to the temple in this case to make their sacrifice. The last thing they expect is to be cheated about their money and its value. But that's what was happening, and that's what's happening now, and it's outrageous. When the Federal Reserve injects trillions of new dollars into the economic bloodstream, where does that money come from? If it's created and it's new, where does it come from? And the answer is it comes from all of us. The people who are really cheated are the elderly, who have saved their money and have to live off of it, and it's now diminished. It comes from the poor person on the street. It comes from everybody. It comes from the homeless. It comes from the wealthy. It comes from everybody because it dilutes the value of that money. And so the government can say, hey, we're not charging you any taxes, you poor people. We're just giving you services. But they're doing it with diminished dollars, with diluted money. It's a scam. As it used to be, you could buy a home, and that was your ticket to middle class. You could scrape and borrow and fight and make good decisions, and you could buy a home, and you could ratchet up and buy another home and another home, and maybe when you die you could actually leave your children something. Not anymore. It's like the Middle Ages. A tiny few have the money. The rest of them, they're lucky if they get a cow. They work the land. So we get the internet, and we get flush toilets. Kings didn't used to have flush toilets. We get a few of these things, but it's like the Middle Ages. Only a tiny group of people now can be wealthy. The rest can never be wealthy. we've always had corruption, and that we always will, and that's human nature. That's not numbers or banks. It's human nature. But it's reached such a degree. It is so bad. It's my Russian friends, when I talk to them about corruption in their country, which they have, laugh at me. They say, yours is the only difference between ours and yours is legal. You've legalized it. So these people are stealing money. They're taking money without the labor by manipulating the currency. And somebody has to produce something. Somebody has to produce a widget. Somebody has to work. Real wealth consists of natural resources, or combining those resources, or manufacturing. That's where real wealth comes from. There was a time in England where real wealth was wood. If you stole from your neighbor's wood pile, you could be hung, because that was real wealth. Real wealth in the Old West was a horse. If you stole a man's horse, you could be hung, because that was real wealth. That's real wealth. And real wealth, for much of history, has been gold. So by making real wealth, or trying to make real wealth, paper money, and then giving it to some and not to others, in abundance to some and not to others, is a terrible game that we've begun here.
When it comes to banking and the federal government, as a presidential historian, I'm sure you've studied the Jackson family. Do you have any interesting stories about Andrew Jackson's family that you can tell us?
Well, quite a interesting personality, and interesting story. His wife, Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel, was a very devout Christian and very pious. But her first husband, who died, it took the Tennessee state legislature to dissolve her marriage, because they couldn't find it, and didn't know where he was. So she remarried and married Andrew Jackson, and he won the election, and she became the first lady. So she went to Nashville to buy her dress for the inauguration, and when she got to Nashville, she saw these newspapers that had been hidden from her. The news had been hidden. It was a very vicious political campaign. I find it very amusing today to hear people say, oh, politics has gotten so bad today. It's much worse than it used to be. But it's not so. It's always been pretty tough. And they had claimed that Rachel Jackson was a bigamist. It turned out that her husband had been found, and then he did die, but he died at a different date than what the state legislature had determined, and so she has actually ended up married to him and Andrew Jackson at the same time. So they called her an adulteress and a bigamist, and were attacking her in the newspapers, and he had hidden all of this from her. And when she read these old newspapers stacked up there in the stores, she was brokenhearted, and she became very ill, and she died. She never set foot in the White House, never saw Washington, D.C., and he went to Washington alone and was sworn in as president alone. So Andrew Jackson had a low tolerance for critics after that.
Wow. Now, I've heard it said that Andrew Jackson's dying words was that he killed the banks.
I've heard that, but I can tell you this. I can tell you that when he was a little boy, his father died before he was born. He's one of 3 presidents whose fathers died before he was born. Bill Clinton was another. And so he's very attached to his mother, and his mother was gone all the time. She tended Revolutionary War heroes, and they were often wounded and hurt in battle, and so she took care of them. And in the process of taking care of these heroes, she contracted a disease herself, and she died, and he felt abandoned. So when he died with many bullets in his body, including one lodged very close to his heart. And the story was he got these bullets in battle, in the heat of battle, and in duels that he had with feuds with other politicians. Very tough old buzzard. But a psychologist who advised me in the writing of my book said that here was a man in one long search through his life back into the arms of his mother. When he was a little boy, she had to be gone because she had to take care of wounded soldiers. So here was a man who made sure when he died, he was a wounded soldier, that he would be worthy of the arms of his own mother. He was a tough old guy, and he was willing to fight fights that others weren't willing to do, and one of those was with the banks. And I can't confirm, because there are different stories about what he said when he died, but it's very typical of him that he would have said something just like that.
Well, the movie Creed of Gold was largely filmed in Indianapolis, Indiana. I've heard that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is made out of Indiana limestone, and I believe you have a Hoosier connection to Indiana. Do you have any special memories from Indiana?
Yeah, the home I lived in Indianapolis was made out of Indiana limestone. Yeah, I was born in Muncie, Indiana, and I lived for a while in Terre Haute, Indiana, and then Indianapolis for a number of years, and then South Bend for a number of years, which was really fun. Great memories. But I never saw the Indianapolis 500 until I left the state, and then I came back. That's typical of a lot of Hoosiers.
So another great Hoosier to end up in the White House. Wow. Well, thank you so much. Be sure to check out more about Doug Wead on his website, dougwead.com. Find out more interesting things about our presidents and presidential families. Also, be sure to check out the movie Creed of Gold. Go to creedofgold.com to see a trailer, or go to your favorite social networking site, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, /Creed of Gold.